For 11 years, nobody had called Armando Toscani anything affectionate. Men twice his age called him Sir. Armed men lowered their voices around him. His enemies had learned that even saying his name carelessly could become an expensive mistake. Then Mikhail Bailey became his secretary. 3 weeks later, at exactly 11:43 on a Thursday night, she walked into a private meeting with 7 of Armando's most dangerous men, placed a confidential folder into his waiting hand, and called him baby. The word left her mouth so naturally that Mikhail made it 3 steps toward the door before her brain caught up. Then she stopped. Oh God! Her mother. 30 seconds earlier, she'd ended a phone call with, "Love you, baby." And apparently 19 hours without sleep had caused Michele's brain to abandon all standards of professional vocabulary. Nobody around the table moved. 7 hardened men suddenly found fascinating things to look at that weren't Armando. Michele considered her options. Apologize. Run. Change her name. Possibly begin a quiet new life, somewhere Armando Toscani had never heard of, which unfortunately eliminated most of the Western Hemisphere. Slowly, she looked back. Armando was watching her. Not angry. That would have been easier. There was something almost amused in his dark eyes. Michele attempted to retreat with what remained of her dignity. Her heel caught the leg of a chair. Because apparently humiliation had a sequel. The room tilted. She never hit the floor. Armando caught her around the waist and pulled her upright. Mikhail found herself pressed against the most intimidating man she'd ever met. His hand firm against her back. His face close enough to erase every coherent thought in her head. Then she saw it. The smallest curve at the corner of his mouth. Armando Toscani was smiling. Say that again? Michele stared at him. Absolutely not. Death might have been inevitable, but she refused to schedule it herself. Then Armando's phone rang. The smile vanished. He listened for less than 10 seconds, and somehow every man around the table knew. Chairs moved. Jackets opened. The room that had been laughing silently at Mikhail a moment earlier suddenly felt dangerous. Someone had attacked a Toscani convoy, and whoever ordered it knew exactly where Armando was supposed to be that night. Michele's embarrassment disappeared, because as 7 pairs of suspicious eyes slowly turned toward her, she realized 2 things at once. Armando Toscani was definitely not just a businessman, and accidentally calling him baby might no longer be the biggest mistake she'd made that night. Armando looked at her, not with anger, with something far more unsettling, because for the first time, he couldn't tell whether his instincts were warning him about Mikhail Bailey or pulling him toward her. Okay, I need to know who else's stomach just dropped right along with Mikhail's. If you accidentally called your terrifying boss baby in front of 7 armed men, what would you have done? Apologized, fled the building, or committed fully, like Michele did with very much Mr. Toscani, possibly the most Mr. Toscani anyone has ever been? Tell me in the comments. I want the full unhinged recovery attempt. Subscribe, because Armando Toscani is about to learn that the most dangerous person in that building might just be the woman who can't stop talking when she's nervous. Let's begin. Michele Bailey hit the lobby of Toscani International already 5 minutes behind the schedule she'd set for herself, which was not, technically, the same thing as being late. That was an important legal distinction she intended to defend if anyone ever asked. Nobody asked. Nobody at Toscani International seemed to ask anyone anything they didn't already know the answer to. The elevator doors were closing. She lunged, caught them with one hand, and felt her heel catch the threshold hard enough to send the stack of contracts under her arm sliding sideways. She caught them against her hip in a move that would have looked, from a distance, almost intentional. From up close, it looked like a woman wrestling a small paper avalanche into submission. By the time the doors opened on the executive floor, Michele had smoothed her blazer, fixed her hair, and arranged her face into the expression of a competent professional who had never once negotiated with God in a stairwell. 6 seconds. That was her record. 3 weeks into the job, she'd learned the commandments of the 40th floor the way other people learned a new country's traffic laws, quickly, and out of fear of consequences she didn't fully understand. Never touch the locked drawer in his desk. Never reroute his calendar without asking first, even by 10 minutes. Espresso. No sugar. Cup turned so the handle faced his right hand, because apparently that mattered. Nobody knocked on a closed door during a meeting. And nobody, not the board members, not the men in dark suits who definitely weren't accountants no matter what their badges said, called Armando Toscani anything but Mr. Toscani. She'd broken exactly none of those rules. She considered this a personal triumph roughly on par with running a marathon. Miss Bailey? Armando didn't look up from the document on his desk. He never did, not right away, which Michele had decided was either a power move or genuinely just how he read. The Kessler contract references last quarter's shipping terms, she said, sliding the folder onto his desk at the correct angle, the one that didn't require him to turn it. Your 10 o'clock renegotiated those Tuesday. Verbally, I flagged it before it went out. That got her a look. Brief. Assessing. Good catch, Miss Bailey. 4 words. Michelle treated them like a Christmas bonus. She'd caught 2 other things that week that his last assistant apparently never had. A scheduling collision between a shareholder call and a dentist appointment he refused to reschedule. Small, human, oddly endearing, and a client's offhand verbal request from 4 days earlier that nobody else had bothered writing down. Michele remembered things she always had. Conversations stuck to her like burrs. She could recite what her college roommate had said during a fire drill freshman year. It had never been useful for anything except winning arguments. Here, apparently, it kept her employed. What she didn't fully understand, what she'd decided, with admirable self-preservation not to investigate, was why Armando Toscani's security detail looked like they expected an ambush at any moment, why grown men lowered their voices when he walked past, or why the clients, who visited after 6 p.m., never seemed to bring briefcases, only each other. Toscani International. Import, export, logistics, real estate. That was the job description. Michele suspected the job description had quietly declined to mention several relevant nouns, possibly including organized and crime. She filed the suspicion somewhere dark and didn't open it again. The pay was good. The health insurance was excellent. She was 27 and tired of being underestimated at jobs that paid half as much. By 11 that night, the floor had emptied except for the low gold light in Armando's office and the desk lamp at her own station outside it, where she was simultaneously proofing a contract, answering an email from legal, and balancing his espresso on a stack of folders because both her hands were somehow already full. Her phone buzzed against her hip, her mother's name. Yes, Mom, I know, I remembered. Michele wedged the phone between her shoulder and ear, typed one-handed, nudged a folder square with her elbow. No, I didn't forget your birthday. I forgot to say I didn't forget. Okay. Love you too, baby. She hung up, dropped the phone in her pocket, and carried the folder and the espresso into the conference room, where Armando sat at the head of the table, with 6 men Michele had learned not to make eye contact with, and Rafael Moretti beside him, mid-sentence. The Delgado numbers won't hold past Friday, Rafael was saying. Michele set the espresso down without spilling it, a personal miracle, and held out the folder toward Armando's open hand. Here you go, baby. Silence. Not quiet. Silence. The total kind. The kind with weight. Rafael's pen stopped moving. Somewhere down the table, a man who definitely wasn't an accountant developed a profound interest in his own knuckles. Michele's brain, several seconds behind her mouth as usual, finally caught up and delivered its verdict. Oh no. I didn't. That was, she heard herself say it and hated every syllable. Residual baby. From the phone call, my mother. Nobody's face changed. Mr. Toscani. Obviously, very much Mr. Toscani. Possibly the most Mr. Toscani anyone has ever been. She took a step back toward the door, aiming for a dignified retreat. Her heel caught the chair leg. The floor tilted. She never reached it. Armando's hand closed around her waist and pulled her upright in one motion, and for one long, unbearable second, Mikhail was pressed against him, his hand steady at her back, his face close enough that she could see he wasn't angry at all. There was, unmistakably, the smallest curve at the corner of his mouth. Say that again? Mikhail had prepared several possible outcomes for the morning, after calling her boss baby in front of 7 men who each looked capable of disposing of a body without leaving carpet stains. Termination. Reassignment to a windowless closet somewhere in accounting. A stern conversation involving the phrase, boundaries. She had rehearsed responses to all 3 in the shower, out loud, which her downstairs neighbor had almost certainly heard through the pipes. What she had not prepared for was nothing. Armando arrived at 8:15 exactly, as he did every day, hung his coat, and said, "Good morning, Miss Bailey," in the same even voice he used for board minutes and hostage negotiations. Presumably, "Good morning, Mr. Toscani." She held out his espresso, no sugar, handle turned right. Steady hand. She was very proud of the steady hand. He took it. "Thank you." That was it. No mention of the incident. No mention of the word. Michele exhaled for what felt like the first time since Thursday night, and allowed herself, cautiously, to believe she'd survived. Then, 3 hours later, she brought him a signed contract and he said, without looking up, "Nothing else?" Michele froze mid-turn. "Excuse me? You handed me the folder." He turned a page. "Usually there's something else." Oh, he was doing this on purpose. The absolute audacity. Mikhail felt heat crawl up the back of her neck and refused, on principle, to let it reach her face. "No," she said. "Nothing else." Pity. He said it the way he said everything. Flat, unbothered, eyes on the document. And Mikhail stood there for a full 3 seconds, trying to determine whether Armando Toscani had just made a joke, because nothing in his expression confirmed it, and yet something in the air had absolutely, unmistakably shifted. She left before her face could finish deciding what to do about it. Armando did not, as a rule, replay conversations. He replayed threats. He replayed numbers, discrepancies, the precise cadence of a man lying about a shipment that never arrived. He did not replay the way a woman's voice caught on a single syllable before turning the color of her own embarrassment. And yet,
"Baby."
11 years he had built a room people were careful not to breathe wrong in. He had built it deliberately, brick by brick, out of silence and consequence, because the alternative, softness, unpredictability, the version of himself that used to laugh easily in a kitchen with his brother, had gotten Matteo killed. Mikhail Bailey had walked into that room 3 weeks ago and immediately begun rearranging the furniture without asking. He should have corrected her Thursday night. 1 sentence. "That is not how you will address me." He had said it, in some form, to every person who had ever slipped. He had not said it to her. Instead, he had asked her to say it again, and then spent the better part of a sleepless night deciding that had been a mistake, for reasons that had nothing to do with the men at that table. "You're smiling," Raphael said, without looking up from the report on his desk. "I'm not." "You did it again." Small, but present. Raphael finally raised his eyes. "It's Miss Bailey. It's the Delgado numbers. The Delgado numbers have made you frown for 6 months. They have never once made you look like a man deciding whether to lie to his oldest friend." Raphael's mouth twitched. "For the record, you're deciding badly." Armando said nothing, which Raphael correctly interpreted as confirmation. The mood in the office changed by Tuesday afternoon, and Michele felt it the way she felt weather coming, a pressure shift, before anyone said a word. Tony Russo, who normally nodded at her with the warmth of a filing cabinet, actually spoke to her, which was somehow more alarming than his silence. "Miss Bailey, where were you Thursday between 10 and 11 p.m.? Here," she blinked. "I'm always here. Why?" He didn't answer. He wrote something down and walked away, and Michelle stood by the copier, feeling, for the first time in 3 weeks, genuinely unsettled rather than merely mortified. She found Raphael an hour later, reviewing something on her own computer, at her own desk, with the particular stillness of a man doing something he'd rather not be caught doing. "Is there a reason you're in my email?" "Security protocol." Raphael didn't look up. "Standard after an incident." "What incident?" He closed the laptop. "You'll want to speak with Armando." She did not want to speak with Armando. She wanted, very badly, to understand what had happened between Thursday's ridiculous phone call ringing through a silent conference room and today, when apparently her calendar, her computer, and her comings and goings had all become matters of interest to men who carried guns to work. Inside his office, Armando stood at the window with his back to the door, a single sheet of paper in his hand. He didn't turn around when she entered. "A private meeting location was compromised Thursday night," he said. Only 4 people had the updated time. Michele's stomach dropped somewhere near her shoes. He finally turned and set the page on the desk between them. Her own name sat near the top of a very short list. Michele stared at her own name on the page and felt something small and cold settle in her chest. Michele Bailey, right there, third on a list of 4, in a font that made her feel like evidence rather than a person. "You think I did this?" "I think 4 people had access to that information." Armando's voice was even, unreadable, the same voice he used for board minutes. "You are one of them." "That's not an answer." She heard her own voice climb, and didn't stop it. "That's a fact you're hiding behind so you don't have to actually accuse me of anything." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, that she'd said it out loud instead of apologizing her way out the door, the way she had Thursday night. Michele was a little surprised herself, but 3 weeks of catching his mistakes, memorizing his coffee order, and staying past 10 because he never once asked her to, had bought her, she decided, at least the right to be angry when he treated her like a stranger. "If you think I sold information to whoever attacked that convoy," she said, "ask me. Actually ask me. Don't have Tony interrogate me by the copier, and don't have Raphael go through my email like I won't notice." Armando was quiet for a moment. It was not, she realized, the quiet of a man deciding how to punish her. It was the quiet of a man recalibrating. "Where were you Thursday between 10 and 11 p.m.? "At my desk. The whole time. I brought you the folder at 11:43 because I checked the clock right before I walked in. Because I always check the clock before I interrupt you, because you told me during my first week that you hate being interrupted without warning." She was breathing fast now, the words tumbling out the way they did when she was frightened and trying not to show it. "I called my mother at 11:40. You can check the phone records. I have never in my life had a reason to talk to anyone about your schedule, except the people who are already in this building. And frankly, sir, if I were selling secrets, I would like to think I'd have picked a code name slightly more professional than baby." The corner of his mouth moved. Just barely. He caught it before it became anything. "That location change was verbal," he said instead. "I told you and Raphael and Mercer in this office, at 4 o'clock, with the door closed. Nothing was written down. Nothing was in the calendar system." Michele frowned, the anger cooling into something more useful. "Then whoever leaked it didn't hack anything." "No. They heard it." Armando looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not warmth, not yet, but the beginning of attention, the way a man looks at a puzzle piece he hadn't expected to fit. "Go on," he said. Michele's mind, which had spent the last 2 days in a state of low-grade panic, suddenly found its footing on familiar ground. This she could do. She'd spent her whole life being the person who remembered what everyone else forgot. Every argument her parents thought they'd had privately. Every promise a friend made and later denied making. Every offhand comment a professor let slip that turned out to be on the final exam. "You told us at 4, she said slowly, working it out as she spoke. "Raphael was here. I was at my desk right outside. Door open a crack, because it's always open a crack. You never close it all the way when it's just scheduling." Daniel came in around 4:15 to return a signed folder. He was only in the doorway maybe 10 seconds. 10 seconds is enough to hear a room number. "It is." She hesitated. "I'm not saying it was him. I don't know that. I'm saying the leak didn't come from a computer. It came from somebody's ears." Armando studied her the way he studied contracts. Closely, for longer than was comfortable, as if there might be language in her he'd missed the first read. "That's a reasonable theory," he said finally. "It is also not proof of anything, and I will not accuse a man I've worked with for 6 years on the basis of 10 seconds in a doorway. I'm not asking you to." Michele lifted her chin. "I'm asking you to stop looking at me like I'm a leak in a very expensive pipe." That finally produced something closer to a real reaction. Not quite a smile, but the loosening of something in his shoulders that she was coming, against every professional instinct she had, to recognize as the closest Armando Toscani got to relief. "Miss Bailey." "Yes." "You're cleared." "Thank you," she said, with more feeling than the moment strictly required, and turned to go before either of them said anything else that might complicate a workplace already balanced on the edge of several different disasters. Raphael found him 20 minutes later, still standing at the window, the compromised meeting file untouched on the desk behind him. "Well? Stop investigating Miss Bailey." Raphael raised an eyebrow. "Because she's cleared?" "Because I said so." "That's not an answer." Raphael's mouth curved, echoing without meaning to the exact words Mikhail had used minutes earlier. "You've said that sentence to me twice in 6 years. Once about your mother's driver, whom you trusted, and once, right now, about a woman who has worked here 3 weeks and just accused you, to your face, of hiding behind a spreadsheet." Armando didn't answer. Raphael studied him with the patient, faintly amused attention of a man who had watched Armando Toscani outmaneuver senators and dismantle rival families without changing his expression, and who now, apparently, got to watch him lose an argument to his own secretary and call it clearance. "She's not wrong, you know," Raphael said, quieter now, "about it being someone's ears instead of a hard drive. I know. Which means whoever it is has been standing close enough to hear you for months." Raphael's humor faded. "That should worry you more than it seems to." Armando looked at the file again. Michele's name, crossed through now in his own hand, and thought, unwillingly, of the 4:15 visit, 10 seconds in a doorway, a folder returned a day earlier than necessary. "It worries me considerably," he said. "I would simply prefer it not be someone I've trusted for 6 years." Mikhail knew something had changed the moment the elevator doors opened and Tony Russo actually smiled. Not at her, past her. At someone approaching from the far end of the corridor, and the sight of Tony Russo's face doing anything other than its usual impression of a locked door was enough to make Mikhail turn around to see what could possibly be responsible. The woman coming toward them moved like she'd never once in her life doubted she belonged exactly where she was standing. Silver threaded through dark hair pulled into an elegant twist. A coat that probably cost more than Michele's rent, though she was determined never to think that thought about anyone in this building again after learning what some of them did for a living. Warm brown eyes, sharp and assessing, that reminded Mikhail so precisely of Armando's that she nearly said something embarrassing out loud. "You must be Mikhail," the woman said, before Mikhail had said a single word. "Armando mentioned you." "He did?" That came out an octave higher than intended. "Not by choice." The woman extended a hand, warm and firm. Caterina Toscani, his mother. Everyone else here is terrified of me, which I find useful, so don't ruin it by looking too comfortable. Michele, who had spent the last 3 weeks bracing for the entire Toscani family to be some variation of Armando's controlled silence, found herself unexpectedly charmed within 4 sentences. "I'll do my best to look nervous," she said. "It shouldn't be hard. I'm nervous most of the time anyway." Caterina's mouth curved, delighted. "Good. Honesty. This building doesn't get enough of it." Armando appeared in his office doorway, with the specific expression of a man who had heard his mother's voice in the hallway, and immediately recalculated his entire afternoon. "Mother, you didn't call ahead." "I never do. It ruins the fun of watching your face." Caterina swept past him into his office as though she owned the building, which, Michele reflected, she quite possibly did. "I'm taking you both to lunch. Michele, you're coming. I want to know everything about you that Armando refuses to tell me." "There's nothing to tell," Armando said. "There's always something to tell. You simply decide it isn't mine to know." Caterina glanced at Michele over her shoulder, warm and conspiratorial. "He's been like this since he was 11. Don't take it personally." Michele decided, on the spot, that she liked Caterina Toscani a great deal, and that liking her was probably dangerous. Lunch happened at a small restaurant 2 blocks from the office, where the staff clearly knew Caterina by name and brought bread without being asked. Michele found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since her first day, right up until Caterina set down her wine glass and looked at her with the focused interest of a woman conducting an interview she hadn't announced. "Are you married, Michele?" "Mother, I'm speaking to Michele." "No," Michele said, because there was no version of dodging that question that seemed survivable. "Not married." "Children." Armando set down his fork with a precision that suggested enormous restraint. "Mother." "What?" "I like children." Caterina buttered a piece of bread without looking remotely apologetic. "It's a reasonable question. People have them. Some people even want them." "You like grandchildren you don't have," Armando said, in the flattest voice Michele had heard from him yet, which she was beginning to understand was his version of a plea for mercy. Caterina merely smiled and let the subject drop, which Michele suspected was more strategic than it looked. Later, when Armando excused himself to take a call, Caterina's expression changed, the teasing warmth softening into something quieter, more careful. "He wasn't always like this, you know, closed up like a fist." She turned her wine glass slowly by the stem. "He had a brother, Matteo, younger, louder, the kind of boy who could make a room laugh without trying. Armando adored him." Michele went very still, sensing she was being handed something fragile. "Matteo died," Caterina said simply. "Someone Armando trusted told the wrong person where he'd be. My son has not fully forgiven himself for believing that man, and he has spent every year since making sure nothing depends on trust that he cannot verify himself." She looked up, and for a moment, the formidable woman gave way to something achingly maternal. "I'm not telling you this so you'll pity him. I'm telling you because you should know what you're looking at when he goes quiet." Michele didn't know what to say, so she said nothing, which felt, for once, like the correct choice. They returned to find Armando in the lobby, helping his mother into her coat, with a gentleness Michele hadn't seen from him in 3 weeks of watching him negotiate contracts like Bloodsport. He bent and kissed her forehead, brief and unguarded, and said something low in Italian that made Caterina's stern composure crack into open affection. Michele looked away, feeling like she'd witnessed something not meant for her, and found that the ache in her chest had very little to do with second-hand tenderness and a great deal to do with how badly, suddenly, she wanted to know what it felt like to be looked at that way by him. She filed the thought somewhere dark, and told herself, unconvincingly, that she wouldn't open it again. Caterina caught her son's arm before she left, drawing him aside with the particular quiet of a mother who intended to be heard by exactly one person. "That girl makes you smile," she said. "I smile. Not since Matteo," Armando had no answer for that at all. Armando had built his life around noticing things that mattered. Shipping manifests. The half-second delay in a man's answer before a lie. The precise moment a room shifted from cooperation to fear. He had not intended to notice that Mikhail Bailey took her coffee with too much vanilla syrup, the kind of over-sweet, over-milked concoction that had no business being called coffee at all, and that she drank it anyway, every morning, with visible enjoyment that made the whole ridiculous habit somehow forgivable. He noticed it the way he noticed everything else. Filed it, categorized it, told himself it was irrelevant. It was not irrelevant. It kept resurfacing. He noticed that she tapped her pen against the desk 3 times, no more, no less, when she was concentrating on something difficult, and that the tapping stopped the instant she solved whatever problem she'd been chewing on. He noticed that her laugh had 2 distinct registers, the polite one she offered clients and executives, quick and practiced, and the real one, lower and less controlled, that escaped when she wasn't thinking about being watched. He had heard the real one perhaps 4 times. He remembered every instance with an exactness that troubled him. He noticed when she skipped lunch. She did it more than she should, buried under whatever crisis of the day had landed on her desk, and she never mentioned it, never complained, simply worked through it with the same bright, competent energy, until roughly 3 p.m., when her sentences got shorter and her patience thinner, and she started apologizing for things that didn't require apology. He had begun, without quite admitting to himself why, correcting for it. A tray appeared outside her desk on the days she worked through lunch, ordered under an assistant's name, so it looked like standard office courtesy rather than what it actually was, which Armando declined to examine too closely. Her chair, the one that had been squeaking for 2 weeks because she was too polite to complain about equipment, was replaced overnight with a better one, no explanation given. When rain flooded the avenue outside the building last Thursday, a car had been waiting at the entrance at exactly the hour she usually left, and Michele had thanked the driver and never once asked why Toscani International suddenly extended this courtesy to its secretarial staff. She assumed these were policies. Raphael knew better, and had the good sense, mostly, not to say so out loud. "You had her chair replaced," Raphael said, one afternoon, without preamble, setting a folder on Armando's desk. The old one was defective. The old one was 3 months old. Raphael didn't look up from the papers he was arranging. "You've never once replaced office furniture based on a squeak. I've worked for you 6 years. I would know." Armando said nothing, which by now Raphael correctly understood as agreement he had no intention of voicing. The second leak came on a Tuesday, quieter than the convoy attack, but no less unsettling. A location for a private sit-down with a supplier changed verbally that morning, known only to Armando, Raphael, Daniel Mercer, and, briefly, Mikel, who had been in the room delivering a signed contract at the exact moment the new address was mentioned. By evening, the supplier reported an unfamiliar car parked outside the new location an hour before the meeting. Nothing had happened. Nothing needed to happen. For the message to be clear, someone still knew things they had no right to know. Michele came to him that night with an expression he was beginning to recognize, the one she wore when her mind had caught on something and wouldn't let go, half triumphant and half unsure whether the triumph was warranted. "Daniel was in the doorway again," she said. "This morning, when you mentioned the new address, he came in to drop off the signed distribution agreement. Same as before. Quick. In and out, maybe 15 seconds. 15 seconds is not evidence, Miss Bailey. I know that." She said it with more heat than the moment required, which told him she'd already had this argument with herself before bringing it to him. "I'm not accusing him. I'm telling you a pattern exists. 2 leaks, both verbal changes. Both times, he was in the room, however briefly, right when it happened." Armando studied her for a long moment. He believed her, not the conclusion, not yet, but the observation itself, the discipline of it. She hadn't come to him with an accusation dressed as certainty. She'd come with a fact and let him draw his own line. "Keep noticing," he said finally. "Say nothing to him. Say nothing to anyone. I wasn't planning a press conference." The dry note in her voice pulled something loose in his chest that he chose, deliberately, not to examine. Daniel Mercer had started treating Michelle differently in the past week, and Armando had noticed that too, with an intensity that startled him more than it should have. It was subtle, the kind of small dismissal that wouldn't register as rudeness to anyone not paying close attention. Daniel spoke over her in meetings when she offered a scheduling correction. He addressed his questions to Armando even when Michelle was the one holding the answer. Once, in the hallway, Armando had heard him refer to her, to another executive, as the new girl, very sweet, bit scattered, in a tone that assumed she wasn't within earshot. She had been within earshot. Armando had watched her hear it, watched the brief flicker cross her face before she smoothed it into professional neutrality and kept walking, and had felt something sharp and unfamiliar rise in his chest that took him several minutes to correctly identify as anger. Not the cold, useful kind he employed in business, but something considerably less controlled. He said nothing to Daniel. There was no ground yet to stand on, only a pattern and a feeling, and Armando Toscani did not act on feelings. He told himself that twice, which was, he was beginning to understand, usually a sign he no longer believed it. Michelle stayed late again that Thursday, the anniversary, unknowingly, of the first time she'd called him something no one else in 11 years had dared to say. She was proofing a contract at her desk when the office phone on the executive line rang through to an extension that should have been dark hours ago. She answered out of habit, more than duty, and the voice on the other end was unfamiliar, low, careful. A man who clearly hadn't expected anyone to pick up, asking, with deliberate casualness, whether Mr. Toscani would be at the Delancey warehouse Friday night as scheduled. Michelle went very still. There was no meeting scheduled at the Delancey warehouse, not that she knew of, not that had ever been written down, said aloud, or mentioned to her at all. Michelle reported the call the next morning, before her coffee had even cooled, standing in the doorway of Armando's office with her arms crossed against a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "A man asked if you'd be at the Delancey warehouse Friday night, as scheduled." She watched his face for reaction and got exactly the amount she'd learned to expect. None, outwardly, though something behind his eyes sharpened considerably. "There's no meeting scheduled there. Not that I know of." "There isn't," Armando said. "Which means someone believes there should be. Or someone's testing whether I'll confirm it." The thought had kept her up half the night, turning itself over. "I told him I'd have to check and take a message. I didn't confirm or deny anything. Was that right?" That was exactly right. He said it plainly, without embellishment, and Michelle felt the small, unreasonable warmth of being told she'd done something well, by a man who rationed praise like it cost him something. "Tony will handle the warehouse. You did nothing wrong, Miss Bailey. Go home tonight at a reasonable hour." She didn't, of course, but she appreciated that he'd tried. Katerina's dinner invitation arrived by phone 2 days later, delivered with the transparent innocence of a woman who had never once in her life needed to be subtle and simply enjoyed pretending otherwise. "I'm making Audiobook Sunday. Armando will be there. You should come, since apparently you're the only person in that building who can get him to answer a question directly." "I don't think that's true. It's entirely true, and you'll come anyway." Michelle went, because refusing Caterina Toscani seemed like the sort of decision that invited consequences, and because some small, unguarded part of her had wanted to say yes since the moment the invitation was extended. The house surprised her, not the marble and glass fortress she'd half expected, but something warmer, older, full of photographs in mismatched frames, and the smell of garlic drifting from a kitchen Katerina refused to let staff touch on Sundays. Raphael was already there when Michelle arrived, a glass of wine in hand, looking entirely too amused by whatever he'd walked in on. She's showing him baby pictures, Raphael said, by way of greeting. You're about to witness a war crime. Armando, seated at the dining table with the specific posture of a man enduring something, looked up as Michele entered and, for one unguarded second, looked almost grateful for the interruption. Come! Come! Katerina waved her over, already flipping through a photo album thick with cracked plastic sleeves. This one, Armando, 7 years old, insisted on wearing his father's tie to church because he'd decided he was, and I quote, in charge now. Mikhail looked at the photograph, a small, solemn boy in a tie 3 sizes too large, glaring at the camera with an expression she recognized instantly, because she'd seen it that very week aimed at a supplier who'd tried to renegotiate a contract in bad faith. Oh, this is incredible, Mikhail said, delighted. You've been intimidating people since you could walk. I was 7, Armando said, with the wounded dignity of a man who had clearly hoped this particular photograph had been destroyed years ago. 7-year-old Armando would have fired me on day 1. 7-year-old Armando fired the gardener for planting the wrong tomatoes. Katerina turned the page fondly. Matteo, on the other hand, once let a stray dog into the house during a dinner with the Calabrese family and told everyone it was a gift. The table went briefly, softly quiet. Not grief, not exactly, but the particular hush that surrounds a name spoken with love and loss braided together. He would have liked you, Katerina said to Mikhail, simply, and it landed with more weight than the words alone should have carried. Mikhail didn't know what to say to that, so she reached for her wine and let the silence be gentle instead of heavy, and across the table, Armando watched her do it with an expression she couldn't quite read. After dinner, while Raphael argued with Katerina in the kitchen over whether the recipe needed more wine or less, Katerina drew Michele aside near the window, her voice dropping into something private. I know how it looks, she said. The questions. The grandchildren jokes. My son thinks I'm running a campaign. Aren't you? A little. Katerina's smile faded into something more honest. But it isn't really about weddings or timelines, or babies I'll probably be too impatient to wait for properly. I watched that boy stop believing in tomorrow the day his brother died. I don't need him married. I need him to want something enough to be frightened of losing it again. She looked at Mikhail with sudden, unmistakable clarity. I think he started. Mikhail's chest ached in a way she didn't examine too closely. Later, on the back porch, away from the noise of the kitchen, Michele found herself alone with Armando for the first time all evening, the city lights soft and distant beyond the yard. Your mother's terrifying, she said. She'd take that as the highest compliment. I meant it as one. Michele leaned against the railing. You don't talk about him, Matteo. No. You should. Sometimes. She said it carefully, without pressure. Not because it fixes anything, because he sounds like he deserved to be talked about. Armando was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had lost some of its usual precision. He would have found tonight very funny. You, at that table, unafraid of any of us. I'm terrified of most of you. You hide it well. I've had practice. She looked up and found him closer than she'd realized, close enough that the porch light caught the line of his jaw, close enough that the careful distance they'd maintained for weeks seemed suddenly, dangerously thin. Neither of them moved for a long second. Then Armando's gaze dropped, briefly, to her mouth, and Michele felt her heartbeat do something reckless and unprofessional. They both stepped back at the same moment, as if some shared instinct had fired at once. Why do you never call me Armando? He asked, quieter than she'd ever heard him. Because I enjoy employment, she said, and he almost smiled. From the kitchen doorway, unnoticed by either of them, Raphael had gone very still, his wine glass forgotten in his hand, and further down the street, parked just beyond the reach of the porch light, Daniel Mercer sat behind the wheel of his car, watching the two of them through the window a moment longer than any reasonable errand required. The call came at 6:14 in the morning, And Mikkel knew before she'd even found her phone in the dark that whatever it was had already gone wrong. Convoy was hit on 9th, Raphael said. No greeting, his voice tight in a way she'd never heard from him. Nobody's dead. 2 men in the hospital. Be at the office in 30 minutes. She was there in 22. The floor that greeted her looked nothing like the calm, monastery-quiet space she'd learned to navigate over the past month. Men moved through the hallways with the clipped urgency of people who'd done this before and hated that they had to. Tony stood near the elevator bank with a phone against his ear and an expression carved from granite. Armando's office door was closed, which never happened before 9, and when Michelle knocked and let herself in anyway, she found him standing at the window, with his jaw set and his hands, for the first time since she'd known him, not entirely steady. The convoy was routed to 9th Street verbally. This morning, at 5 a.m., he said, without turning around. I changed it myself, over the phone, because of construction on the original route. 4 people knew. Raphael, Tony, myself. A pause. And Daniel. Michele's stomach dropped. You think? I think 2 men are in a hospital because someone I have trusted for 6 years told the wrong person where to find them. His voice was very quiet, very controlled, and somehow more frightening for it than if he'd been shouting. Or I think it's someone else, and I am about to accuse a man I have no proof against, based on a doorway and a coincidence. Michele stood very still, understanding, with sudden clarity, that this was the version of Armando Toscani that other people feared. Not cruelty, not violence, but a stillness so absolute it felt like the moment before a building collapsed. I remember something, she said carefully. 3 weeks ago, during the first leak, the private meeting, Daniel used a phrase on a call afterward, talking to a supplier, about the location, not panning out. At the time, I thought nothing of it. But he said it before anyone had told him the meeting fell through. He said it like he already knew. Armando turned to face her fully now. You didn't mention this before. I didn't remember it. As something until just now. Her voice caught with frustration at herself. That's how my memory works. Things surface when something else jars them loose. I'm not hiding things from you. I promise. I just don't always know what matters, until it matters. He studied her for a long moment, and whatever he saw seemed to settle something in him, because his shoulders eased fractionally. It isn't enough, he said. A phrase, a doorway, 10 seconds, twice. I cannot move against a man on the strength of your memory alone, however good it is. I know that. She said it with more heat than she intended. I'm not asking you to arrest him over a phone call. I'm telling you the pattern is getting louder, and I don't understand why you're not listening to it. Because listening to patterns instead of proof is how men get killed based on suspicion instead of fact. His voice sharpened, the first real edge she'd heard from him. I have spent 11 years making sure decisions in this family are made on evidence, not instinct, not fear. I will not change that, because a feeling feels convincing. Then what was Matteo? The words left her before she'd fully decided to say them, and she watched them land like a slap. Armando went very still. I'm sorry, she said immediately. I shouldn't have. No, he said, quietly. Say it. Finish it. She swallowed. Your mother told me. Not everything. Enough. Someone you trusted told the wrong person where he'd be. And you've spent every year since, building a life where nothing depends on anyone's word, but your own verified proof. I understand why. I do. But you can't run every decision through a spreadsheet, Armando. Some things you have to feel your way through, or you'll miss them until it's too late again. The silence that followed was long enough that Michele wondered if she'd finally, truly, ended her employment. I want you away from the office, he said instead. Today. Work from home until this is resolved. Excuse me? It's not a request. His voice had gone hard again, but this time she recognized the fear underneath it. the same fear that had built every locked door and rigid rule in this building. 2 men are in a hospital. I don't know yet who is responsible. Until I do, I want you somewhere I can be certain you're safe. You don't get to decide that for me. I do, actually. I'm your employer. Don't. The word came out sharp, wounded. Don't hide behind that. Not after everything. He flinched, barely, almost imperceptibly, but she saw it. You're treating this like every other uncomfortable thing you'd rather joke your way through, he said, quieter now, and it landed harder than shouting would have. This isn't a spilled coffee, Mikkel. This is men with guns and a leak I can't yet identify, and I need to know you're not in the blast radius while I find them. It landed because it was true, and she hated that it was true. Matteo died because I trusted the wrong person and sent him somewhere I thought was safe, Armando said, and his voice cracked on the name in a way she'd never heard from him. I approved that meeting. I told him it was secure. I was wrong, and it cost him his life. I am not doing that again, not with you. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded, and Mikhail felt every sharp thing she'd been about to say dissolve into something gentler. She crossed the room without deciding to, and put her hand against his chest, over the tie he probably ironed himself, feeling his heartbeat unsteady beneath her palm. I'm not asking you to stop protecting people, she said softly. I'm asking you to let me stay close enough to help you do it. Armando looked down at her, something breaking open behind his eyes that she'd never seen from him before. Not control, not calculation, just a man who had spent 11 years terrified of exactly this moment. He kissed her. It wasn't careful. It wasn't calculated, the way everything else about him was calculated. His hand came up to cradle her jaw, like she was something he'd been afraid to want, and Mikkel kissed him back with all the weeks of tension and teasing and terror finally collapsing into something simple and inevitable. When they broke apart, neither of them reached for a joke. This seems professionally inadvisable, Michele whispered, finally, because some habits ran too deep to abandon entirely. Extremely, Armando said, and didn't let go of her. The knock on the door came a moment later. Sharp, urgent, Tony's voice on the other side tight with something that hadn't been there minutes ago. Sir, you need to see this, now. Tony didn't wait to be invited in. He stepped through the door with a tablet in his hand and an expression that made Michele's stomach drop before he said a single word. Financial records, he said, holding the screen toward Armando. A transfer. $12,000, routed through an offshore account 2 days ago, tied to an IP address that matches this building. Armando took the tablet. Michelle watched his face do the thing it did during negotiations, go utterly, deliberately blank, and felt something cold crawl up her spine before he even spoke. Whose account? Tony's eyes flicked to Michelle, just once, and that was answer enough. That's not possible, Michelle said, before anyone else could say it for her. I don't have $12,000. I don't have $1,200. Tony, my student loans have opinions about that. The transfer originated from a shell account under your name, Tony said, not unkindly, but not backing down either. Registered address matches your apartment. It came in 2 days after the convoy was hit. The room felt suddenly very small. Michele looked at Armando, and for one terrible second, she saw him doing exactly what he'd warned her he would never do. Running the numbers, weighing evidence, calculating. I didn't do this, she said. I need you to hear me say that clearly. I did not open that account. I have never seen that account. Armando set the tablet down on his desk, slowly, and looked at her for a long moment that stretched far past comfortable. I believe you, he said. Tony's eyebrows lifted a fraction. Sir, the board is going to ask. I know what the board is going to ask. Armando's voice hardened into something Michele hadn't heard, directed at anyone but an enemy before. And I will remind them that evidence which appears exactly 48 hours after a woman becomes inconvenient to someone is not evidence. It's a message. A message, Mikhail repeated, working through it. Meaning someone wanted this found. Someone wanted me blamed. Someone who watched you get closer to figuring out what they've been doing, Armando said, and decided the easiest way to stop you was to make it look like you were the one doing it. Mikhail felt something click into place, cold and clean. I could have exposed this a dozen times if I actually wanted money for it. I've had access to your calendar, your verbal changes, every location for a month. If I were selling information, don't you think I'd have made considerably more than $12,000 by now? That's precisely what I told Tony. Armando's mouth had gone flat and dangerous. Whoever built this account didn't think it through. They assumed a scared woman and a pile of numbers would be enough. They assumed I was decorative, Michele said slowly, an old, familiar bitterness rising with new purpose behind it. Bubbly, scattered. The kind of person who spills coffee and doesn't notice when someone's using her as a doorway to listen through. Armando looked at her sharply. Daniel, I think so. I think so. I still don't have proof, but... She stopped, something else surfacing, the way it always did, sideways and unannounced. Wait, the account. Tony said it was registered to my apartment address. I gave Daniel my new address 3 weeks ago for the courier delivery of my parking permit. He was standing right there when I read it out loud to the building super over the phone. The room went quiet. That's not proof either, Armando said, but there was something different in his voice now. The sound of a man watching the last piece of a puzzle settle into a shape he didn't want to see. But it's enough to build a trap around. The plan formed quickly. In the tight, urgent way decisions got made when a family had already lost 2 men to a hospital bed that morning. We give him something real to bite, Armando said, gathered with Raphael, Tony, and Mikhail around the conference table where, a month ago, she'd called him baby in front of 7 armed men. A meeting location changed verbally in a conversation only Daniel could overhear. If it's him, whoever he's feeding information to will move on that location. And if it isn't him, Raphael asked, then we've wasted an evening, and I owe the man an apology I will not enjoy giving. They chose the old distribution warehouse on Halsey, a real building, rarely used, easy to watch from a distance. Armando delivered the fake change himself, in his office, door cracked exactly the way it always was, mentioning the location to Raphael in a voice pitched to carry to anyone lingering in the hallway. Daniel walked past that doorway 4 minutes later, folder in hand, exactly on schedule. By 8 that evening, a car nobody recognized was parked half a block from the Halsey warehouse, engine running, 2 men inside watching the building with the patient stillness of people waiting for a target that was never going to arrive. Tony's voice came through the radio, low and grim. Confirmed. They're here. Armando closed his eyes for one brief second, the only outward sign, Michele realized, watching from the office where she'd been told, this time without argument, to stay, of 11 years of grief, finally finding somewhere to land. Daniel Mercer was already gone by the time Raphael reached his office, the desk cleared with the efficiency of a man who'd had a bag packed for exactly this contingency for longer than anyone realized. Michele found out later, in pieces, the way she found out most things, through Raphael's clipped account, and Tony's silence, and the small, telling details nobody meant to give her, but did anyway. Daniel had tried the parking garage. Armando and Raphael had gotten there first, cutting off the exit, and Daniel, cornered, calm in the specific way of a man who'd run every possible outcome and accepted several unpleasant ones, had reached for something in his jacket that turned out, when Tony forced his arm down, to be a second phone rather than a weapon, though nobody had known that in the 2 seconds it took to find out. You should have stayed decorative, Daniel had said to Armando, according to Raphael, with something almost like admiration. She was supposed to be too busy tripping over things to notice anything that mattered. It was, Michele thought later, when she finally heard the story in full, the most honest compliment anyone in this building had ever given her, wrapped inside the worst possible delivery. Daniel didn't resist further. He didn't need to. He'd already lost, and men who'd built careers on information understood better than anyone when the information had run out. What he did give up, hours later, in the flat, careful voice of a man negotiating for his own survival, was the name of the organization he'd been feeding for the last 8 months, and the fact that his contact inside it had a history with the Toscani family that went back considerably further than Michele's employment. Armando's face, when he heard it, lost every trace of the relief that should have followed catching the man who'd nearly gotten Michele blamed for his crimes. Because the name Daniel gave belonged to the same network that had swallowed the information that killed Matteo 8 years earlier, and whoever sat at the top of it had never, in all that time, stopped watching the Toscani family from somewhere just out of reach. The name Daniel had given him sat in Armando's chest like a stone for 3 days before he did anything about it, and what he did about it was not, he would later admit, entirely rational. He assigned Michele a driver. Not a suggestion, a fact, delivered the way he delivered instructions to men who worked for him, and it took him embarrassingly long to notice he'd made that mistake. "You'll be picked up at 8 and returned home by 7, he told her, on the Monday after Daniel's arrest, without looking up from the reports on his desk. "Marco will handle it. He's reliable. I have a car. Marco is armed. So is half of your building, apparently. Which I've decided not to think too hard about." Michele's voice had an edge he wasn't used to hearing, directed at him, not since the day he'd cleared her name and she'd stopped being afraid to argue. "I appreciate that you're worried. I do, but you're talking about my schedule like I'm a shipment that needs an escort." "You are the person a criminal organization tried to frame for treason 4 days ago," Armando said, "in an attempt to discredit and remove you because you got too close to the truth. Forgive me if I find the comparison to a shipment somewhat generous." She didn't answer that, and he told himself the silence meant she understood. It did not mean that. By the end of the week, the restrictions had multiplied the way restrictions did in his world, one precaution justifying the next, until Michele's calendar looked less like a working woman's schedule and more like a security protocol with a person attached to it. A driver in the morning, a different driver in the evening, in case a pattern formed. No lunches outside the building without notice given 2 hours in advance. Tony stationed, unofficially, within sight of her desk more often than either of them acknowledged out loud. Armando told himself, each time he added another layer, that he was protecting the woman he loved. He had not said that word to anyone in 8 years. He had certainly not said it to her. But he knew, watching himself construct walls around Michele Bailey brick by careful brick, that this was exactly what love had become for him. A threat assessment, a perimeter, a system of controls designed to guarantee an outcome that no system had ever actually been able to guarantee. Michele found him in his office on Friday evening, and the look on her face told him, before she said a single word, that the reckoning he'd been avoiding had arrived. "I can't get coffee without a phone call," she said. "I told Marco I wanted to walk 2 blocks to the deli, and he looked at me like I'd asked to swim across the Hudson." There are people who wish you harm. There was one man, and he's in custody, and the organization behind him doesn't know my name, my face, or that I exist, according to everything you've told me. She crossed her arms. "You're not protecting me from a threat, Armando. You're protecting yourself from feeling helpless again." He said nothing, which had never once worked as a defense against her, and did not work now. "You can't schedule your way around losing people," Michele said, quieter now, and it landed exactly where she'd aimed it. "I watched you do it for a month before I understood what I was looking at. Every locked drawer, every verbal instruction you insisted on giving in person instead of writing down. None of it was about efficiency. It was about control, because control was the only thing you had left after Matteo. And I understand that. I do, But I am not a system you can secure your way into keeping safe forever. Nobody is. Not even you. I know that. His voice came out rougher than he intended. I know that, and it terrifies me more than anything Daniel Mercer or his employers could ever do. Mikhail went still. I love you, Armando said, and the words felt like something breaking loose after years of being held in place by force. That is why I am terrified. Because loving you means there is now something in this world I cannot fully protect, no matter how many locks I build. And the last time I let myself love someone that much, I buried him. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything neither of them had said out loud until now. I love you too, Michele said, and her voice shook only slightly. But I won't be another locked door in your life, Armando. I won't be something you manage instead of someone you trust. Katerina found her son alone on the porch 2 nights later, a glass of wine untouched at his elbow, and sat beside him without being invited, which she had never in her life required. You've gone quiet again, she said, the bad kind. I told her I loved her and then spent the following week proving I don't trust her to survive without a security detail. Armando's voice was flat with self-recrimination. It went about as well as you'd expect. Katerina was quiet for a moment, considering. You protected Matteo because you loved him, she said finally. You did not kill him by loving him, Armando. The man who leaked his location did that. You have spent 8 years punishing yourself for a crime someone else committed, and building cages around anyone you care about since, calling it safety. And if I'm right to be afraid, you will be afraid regardless. Love does not come with guarantees, mio caro. It never has. She reached over and took his hand, the way she had when he was small enough to need it openly. If you love that girl, don't build her a cage and call it protection. Build her a door she chooses to walk through every day. That is the only kind of safety worth having. Armando sat with that for a long time after his mother had gone inside. The city lights spread out below the porch like something patient, waiting to see what he'd do with what remained of the night. 6 months later, Michele Bailey had a new title, a new office 2 floors down from Armando's, and a reporting structure that no longer required her to explain to human resources why her boss occasionally showed up at her desk for reasons that had nothing to do with scheduling. Chief Administrative Officer. She still wasn't entirely used to seeing it on the door. Armando had dismantled the driver, the double security, the 2-hour notice requirement for lunch, one careful piece at a time, the way a man learns to walk again after an injury, not all at once, and not without setbacks, but honestly, which was the part that mattered. He still worried. She'd stopped expecting him not to, but he asked now, instead of deciding, and that had made all the difference in the world. Daniel's network was gone, dismantled from the outside in over the following months. The deeper connection to Matteo's death, traced back through channels Armando didn't discuss with her in detail, though she suspected, from the particular stillness that settled over him some evenings, that the reckoning hadn't been simple and wasn't entirely finished. Tonight, though, was Sunday, and Sunday meant Katerina's table, and Katerina's table meant Michele had learned to arrive with her guard already up. There's an empty bedroom upstairs, Katerina said, apropos of absolutely nothing, over the second course. Excellent light. Would make a lovely nursery. Armando set down his fork with the specific precision of a man buying himself time. Mother. I didn't say for whom. Katerina took a delicate sip of wine, the picture of innocence. Sophia's been looking at apartments. Sophia, across the table, choked audibly on her water. Do not drag me into this. I'm simply making conversation. You're conducting reproductive reconnaissance, Armando said, flat and dry, and Raphael, at the far end of the table, suddenly found his wineglass fascinating enough to require close, silent study. Mikhail pressed her napkin to her mouth to keep from laughing outright, and caught Armando's eye across the table. Caught, too, the small, helpless twitch at the corner of his mouth that meant he was fighting the same battle she was. Later, after the plates were cleared and Katerina had cornered Sofia into a conversation about apartment listings neither of them wanted to have, Michele found herself alone with Armando in his office at Toscani International, finishing a report that could easily have waited until Monday, and hadn't, because some habits, staying late, working side by side in comfortable quiet, had outlasted the reasons that first created them. She slid a folder across his desk. "Here you go, baby." The word landed in the quiet room exactly the way it had the very first time. A beat of silence, total and absolute. Except this time, there were no 7 armed men to freeze around them, and Mikhail felt none of the old panic climbing her throat. She knew exactly what she'd said. She'd meant every syllable. Armando looked up slowly, and the expression on his face was nothing like that first night. No restrained amusement, no careful distance. Just him, unguarded, in a way he'd spent 11 years making sure nobody ever saw. "Say that again?" Michele set both hands on the desk and leaned toward him, close enough to see the specific warmth in his eyes that had once been so rare she'd catalogued every occurrence like a rare bird sighting. "Baby, no embarrassment, no accident. Choice, offered freely, the way she'd learned to offer everything else to this man who'd spent a decade convinced that wanting things out loud was a kind of danger." Armando stood, came around the desk, and drew her toward him with a gentleness that still, after 6 months, undid her completely. "You realize my mother will hear about this by morning," he said, against her hair. "Your mother probably has surveillance. I don't need surveillance." Katerina's voice, from the doorway, arrived exactly on cue, warm and entirely unrepentant, and Michele buried her laugh against Armando's shoulder while he closed his eyes with the long-suffering patience of a man who had never once, in 37 years, won an argument with his mother, and had clearly stopped expecting to. Katerina's footsteps retreated down the hall, her laughter trailing behind her, and the office settled back into quiet. Armando tipped Michele's chin up, unhurried now, and kissed her the way he did everything that mattered to him, completely and without reservation. The first time Michele Bailey had called Armando Toscani baby, she had wanted the floor to swallow her whole. The second time, he had wanted, more than anything, to hear it again. And now, with his mother's laughter fading somewhere down the hall, and Michele's hand resting inside his, Armando finally understood why. For 11 years, everyone had known exactly what to call him. Boss Sir, Mr. Toscani, Don Toscani, each name a wall he'd built brick by careful brick. Michele was the first person who had ever made him want to be something softer. Outside his office window, the city lights blurred into gold, and somewhere in a file he hadn't yet opened, a single unexplained payment, routed through the same dismantled network, dated 3 days after Daniel Mercer's arrest, sat waiting for a Monday that hadn't come yet. If you made it all the way to "say that again" and felt your chest do something embarrassing, you're not alone. That's the whole point. Michele Bailey walked into the most dangerous office in the city with a coffee stain and a big mouth, and somehow talked her way into the heart of a man nobody else was allowed to get close to. That's not luck. That's a woman who never stopped being exactly who she was, even when the room told her to shrink. So tell me, down in the comments, what was the moment you knew Armando had already lost? Was it the chair, the car in the rain, the porch? Or did he have you the second he said, "say that again," and meant it? Hit subscribe if you want to be there when they do. Drop a baby in the comments if this story owns your whole heart right now. And share this with the one friend who still hasn't recovered from a slow burn done right.